So we'll start today with a panel with Peter, Alison, and Anissa. And during this panel, we will look at different ways how research can support educational technology. Later on, each of our panelists will have a moment to share their results and their individual views on educational technology and research. So I'm sure it will be great. So let's move on to the stage one, the panel. Well, I would like to start with asking everyone, how did you get started as a researcher in educational technology, in EdTech? Who would like to start? Maybe Alison?
Yeah, I don't mind. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think I was one of those humans that was just born curious. So I was definitely a child who drove my teachers mad in school by wanting to know why and how, and maybe ask the questions that were considered a little bit disruptive in the schools that I was in. So I was definitely curious. But my interest in technology actually started as a school student because I happened to be one of the first students in the UK that was allowed to use technology in the maths exam. So I got this thing called a calculator. My teachers didn't have a clue what to do with it. They didn't instruct us on what to do with it. We sort of had to work it out for ourselves. But that was the beginning. And then some 10 years later, when I started to train to teach, these sorts of technologies were a little bit more embedded. And I was actually asked as a newly qualified teacher to be part of a big national pilot study to trial these technologies in my classroom. So I was definitely an early adopter. I was definitely curious, and I was relatively creative in the way I was using it. So I started as an action researcher, as a practitioner, as a teacher. That really did get me thinking about research. I was prompted at that point to think about doing my master's degree. And then in the end, I was sort of slightly lured out of the classroom into the university, where I sort of co-designed research projects with teachers, always looking at sort of innovative technologies and how they were going to shape what happened in classroom practice. And that then sort of broadened to look at curricula and assessment. And here I am. So
wow.
Curiosity is what brought me here.
Curiosity, and I think that, well, your story seems like a dream of every single student who is asking the question, what do I want to do in my life after these studies? And you seem that you knew it from the beginning, right?
It wasn't quite a straight route, Milena. There were a few deviations along the way, but yes, it seems, yeah, perhaps it was always there.
Fantastic. Peter, how about you? How did you start?
So we hear these days that we're all going to have, 4 or 5 different careers in our lifetime. Yeah, I'm that person already. I reckon I'm like a prototype for that. So I was the managing director of one of the very first multimedia companies in Ireland, and it was a dream time. It quite honestly was, I have to say, because as multimedia, and we don't even hear that phrase anymore, but as it emerged, possibilities abounded. And we were in the communication world, that was our business. And I worked in that business for a long time, and we did a lot of good stuff, even working with WWE, or WWF as they were at that time in the United States. And it was a fantastic time. But ironically, I went to do a psychology degree late enough in 2004. And Richard E. Mayer is actually to blame for me coming over to this side of the fence, because when I went through the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, it was just a light bulb moment for me. And I just sort of went, wow, we could do so much with what we know from a multimedia perspective if we moved over and leveraged things like Mayer's theory of multimedia learning, cognitive theory of multimedia learning. And I went and did a degree, as I say, in psychology, and I thought I'm going to take us down that route, and then the recession of 2008 hit hard, hit really hard. But the passion had been lit in me, and I know this sounds like some sort of unbelievable thing, but it's actually 100% true that we were in a bad enough shape, but we had good clients and we could keep going. And I sold the company to the guys. And use that money to actually inveigle my way over to EdTech, because it's where I really wanted to actually be. So a complete change for me then, because I went all the way back from sort of managing and running businesses to actually being completely involved. Went on and did the Masters in Technology Enhanced Learning in Trinity, and as I'm just coming to the end of the PhD now. So basically, yeah, in that respect, I moved over to follow a dream, and I have to say it hasn't disappointed.
Great. Well, I'm sure it won't disappoint you in the longer term either. It's good. It's a good thing to have this compass internally to really follow what interests you, right? And to continue
Absolutely.
this path.
Yeah, completely.
Fantastic. Yeah. Anissa, how about you?
Along the same lines as Peter, actually, I started in media and telecom as an entrepreneur, so in communications as well. And I was always interested in how you can, in building education products. But from the beginning of the company, we always had a 24/7 customer service where our customers would call in and say, hey, this isn't working. We had a product like Netflix is the TV streaming. Very clear when your TV streaming isn't working. You're not vulnerable at all. And same way for our telephone products, super clear, the line's not working, no problem. But I thought, if I have an education tool, how's my customer going to know? Are they going to come to the conclusion that they're not good at learning Spanish? Or is it that they will understand that we didn't actually put the right research into it? And so I realized that I need to figure out how to do this, and how do you build these tools as an entrepreneur and as a startup that doesn't have the budget for a large research team. And so I did some research and ended up doing a PhD because I found out that no one can actually teach these startup research methods in the way that I wanted. And so basically I ended up hearing Rose Luckin in the EdTech podcast. She did a podcast interview in February 2016, where she said that basically tech startups are not empowered by academia in the way that they should be to have taught these research methods to prove their products work and to show the impact and to check and to build this evidence-based mindset. And so she got a budget for basically helping 250 London-based EdTech startups. So I thought, you know what, this is my chance. And I ended up leaving the business, coming for 3 years to learn these methods, and basically have now developed a framework and just about to defend my PhD next week, and then back to helping EdTech startups.
If I just make a point on that from a communications perspective, I mean, the one thing I would say is that, having come from that background, realistically, the difference between communication and teaching and learning is actually not that much. I mean, communication is usually trying to change behavior, for good in a certain direction. And so is learning, except in communication, you've actually got to arrest the person's attention first and get them involved. And they're not bad aspects to bring across when you think about teaching and learning. And I think I was actually horrified at the level of visual design in what was e-learning when I moved across. And I thought, Jesus, we could have made a killing here, because the quality of actual design, wasn't really that good.
Exactly, because I mean, normally you have educators in the field that are professionals and specialists in the field of education. But then when it comes, especially nowadays with all the technology around and the quality of visuals and the materials that are being prepared, it's a completely different world. So merging the two, as you said, I mean, that's bringing new quality to the world of education, right?
Yeah, and great techniques, I mean, because visual design is absolutely fundamental as well to creating good design.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask now, maybe Alison, what is evidence-based EdTech? What is it?
Yes, I talk on this a lot. I mean, it is the $1 million question. What is sufficient evidence to tell us that something in education works? And it's such an easy thing to ask for and an easy statement to make. But when you start to think about what does it mean for something to work in education, you've got so many different factors to think about. So does it work for the learner? Does it work for the education system? Does it work for a parent? There's different people who are interested in whether or not something works or not. And the sort of evidence that those individuals are looking for is really, really different. So if you take an example of a parent maybe looking for an app to help a child learn to read or build their confidence with working with numbers or something, you know, they're probably going to look at, what do other parents say about this? Is it something that, you know, people like me are talking about? You know, can I go and find some sort of anecdotal evidence or some just sound bites, if you like, that tell me that this might be at least worth having a go at? So they're certainly not looking for peer-reviewed academic journals on the whole to make a decision about whether to put an app on their iPad to help their child's reading. So that's one end of the scale is anecdotal evidence, and we all live and thrive on that. It's how we actually communicate about things we like. We just tell stories, don't we? So telling stories of how it might have worked for you is almost the first stage of thinking about evidence. Well, then if you go to the other end of the scale and think about academics and academic research, we work really, really hard to come up with the best methods we can for the sort of study we're trying to do to try and establish that. And if you like, the gold standard in research, not necessarily in educational research, but research in general, is considered the experimental design, because this is a research method that lets you conclude that, if you get it right, that, you know, the intervention or the resource or the app that you've used caused some improvement, or sometimes it might not be an improvement, in something that's important about the learners. But it's hugely challenging to design those studies in education. And I argue strongly it's even harder to design those studies when you're working with an EdTech, because EdTechs don't tend to be stable. It's hard to convince a company to not put any improvements into their product for the 2 or 3 years it might take to do a really robust experimental study. It's actually not going to benefit the company. So there are actually risks attached to EdTech companies in going in for experimental studies, because you have to fix so many variables in the design of your tech. It can be really frustrating, because 3 years later, you know, you'd move on quite substantially. So there's one aspect is about EdTech design, and then the other aspect is about just the complexities of humans and classrooms and learning and children and teachers. And if you're trying to fix variables, there's a lot of very difficult things to try to control there. So in the middle, there's some nice methods that work. Design-based research is a very iterative approach to research that still has the robustness of all the methods we use, but leads us to, if you like, stories of how we can understand how something is working in practice and build on that. And I think at the end of the day, evidence is always cumulative. We're looking to build on what we know already, and taking this more humble approach to the way that we go about the research, so that we build a landscape of evidence rather than thinking that there's any one particular study that's going to ever answer that question, because in my opinion, it can never be answered, partly because EdTech's, humans, learning, just all a little bit too complicated.
And how quickly you finish your research, and within a year from there, the technology, the original technology that you were researching already changes. So it's outdated the moment when
Absolutely,
it's finished. It lasts
Milena.
3 years, right?
Yeah. And I mean, our students who are all looking and researching aspects of digital learning and right now, this is one of the challenges we have. We look at the studies that are published and they're 5, 6, 7 years old, and we're already thinking these are really out of date. You know, the technology's moved on. The way we think about learning is always moving on as well. So lots to think about, lots to think about.
Definitely. Anissa, tell me, what is the last project that you've been working on in terms of, how should I ask this? Some project that you were involved in that is helping the EdTech ecosystem to generate evidence?
Yeah, so
to give an example.
For sure, the Educate program, which is what the topic of my thesis, which was the first research accelerator to support EdTech startups, basically developed these research methods, or worked together with startups to uncover the various methods that would be optimal for in the EdTech context. And so Alison and I are actually publishing on the methods that were most used by EdTech startups, but the actual program, the core of it is a research training program that is essentially a master's level research methods, but in the context of EdTech startups. And so that the Educate program itself was a design-based research study. And after 252 businesses, we basically stabilized, the course stabilized quite well after the first 3 rounds of research. And so the good news is that the Educate programs actually got funding to continue as of January. And so it's going to be starting again, and EdTech startups can actually join the program to take the research training program. And there's actually going to be two streams this time. So the first one is going to be for the research methods training in the EdTech startup context. And the second, which is a level 2, is AI readiness, which is basically thinking about getting your data ducks in order and thinking about starting to automate the data that you're looking at moving forward. So the Educate program is one that I'm involved in and will continue to be involved in the future. And as well as my my thesis research, which is looking more macro at the EdTech, the evidence-based EdTech startup. And so what are the 6 superpowers of these startups? So I've essentially looked at the most successful companies on Educate in the sense that they were able to achieve a level 2 in the awards that are given through the Educate program. The first level is research evidence awareness. And so they were able to understand and make a proposal for the research that would make sense to basically uncover the solutions to make sure that they're basically solving the problem that they're setting out to, the education problem. But the second level is actually doing the research. And so those companies that not only did a research proposal, but actually did their research and showed that they were able to do the research to show that the research question is answered and they're solving the education problem that they are setting out to solve, are basically got an Edward level 2. And I modeled this, the theory and the framework, the LT framework, which is the evidence-informed learning technology enterprise framework, which essentially shows 6 superpowers of EdTech companies. And so that's another research that I'm involved in, which shows that the 6 major capacities that these EdTech startups need to establish in order to be evidence-informed, which is beyond developing the research know-how in the EdTech the EdTech context, but actually establishing these capacities within a startup in the company.
I love the name of the 6 superpowers. That's my comment number 1, and I'm really happy because Anissa today in the afternoon we'll be talking more about it, right? So please get ready for the afternoon to discover the 6 superpowers that Anissa mentioned. I would like to move on to Peter and ask you, how does co-designing EdTech products help generate more robust evidence?
Well, I suppose, I mean, you know, we hear sort of the other side of this story from this sort of Steve Jobs perspective, that, you know, he had a vision and he was going down that route and that's the way it was going. And he's successful, or God bless him, he was successful. But I mean, he's also probably by far the exception. You know, I mean, to co-create is just sense. In terms of reducing the amount of risked time you might invest in something that you consider as an idea. I mean, traditionally an EdTech company would have a great idea, ask a few friends their opinions, you know, and this all goes back to basically, I suppose, my talk on the first day, an awful lot of it, that, you know, and they're going to tell you they love it because of your friends. So you hide yourself away in a garage and you develop out your technology and then go ta-da to the world, you know, I'm here. And that's when you find actually it wasn't really as much as you thought it was. So as I say, while Steve Jobs might buck the trend. For sure, you co-create by understanding the person you're going to serve. And you know, again, if we talk about lean startup, design thinking, jobs to be done, they'll all tell you, get out of the building and talk to the people. Yeah. And we do that with a passion in Learnovate. You know, I mean, again, we have a standardized procedure, which, as I say, I've talked to before, but you need to get out of your building. And maybe just to draw from an example that's ongoing in our own business at the moment, we got out of the building first and asked them, what's the problem? You know, where is the problem? And this was to L&D, to corporate L&D, which might be a little bit wide for this market, but they came back to us and said very loudly, do you know what? L&D cannot show the value, the business value of what they do on up to the C-suite. And we first off start off by triangulating that and looking at, yeah, they're saying it. The industry organizations were saying it, the likes of Towards Maturity in the UK, you know, the academics were saying it. So we were able to triangulate and say, yeah, this is a problem. But the first thing we did was get a few of them on board and started to spitball, throw out there, because you're getting the insights from the people with the problem, you know. And that's how we started to really, in a messy fashion, and that was at the start of COVID, so we did it all online, but we started to co-create an idea. And from there, the mists eventually start to clear. And we got a sort of hypothesis around what a nearly like a formula might look like to do this. We went back to them and said, would this work? And we got them to apply it again in a really rough fashion. And now we've actually got enough evidence behind this and input, and these guys are bought into this. They understand their part of it, but we can be reasonably and then we're moving into actually developing out a technical demonstrator now of this model. I kind of call it, I think it's going to be like Trello. If you're familiar with Trello, it's going to be like a Trello for L&D to show business value. It'll sit beside, and that's one of the big mistakes they were making, by the way, is they thought business value was the end of the chain. But actually, if you're familiar with Kirkpatrick, you know, I mean, did the learner enjoy it? Did the learner learn? Did the learner's behavior change? Did the business make money? They're different questions. It's apples, 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 and then oranges. So actually, we're telling them you need to take that off and run it through the middle rather. So this all came from talking to them, not from any big smart ideas in our heads. Yeah. So that's where it comes from. That's where you get out and you talk. And you know what? The minute we have that technology ready, where does it go? It goes back out to them again, and we talk to them again. So to us, it's just a no-brainer. You just can't do it. And evidence, I think, along with the word evidence, you use the word confidence. You know, it gives us confidence. We can't be 900% sure that we're right, but it gives us confidence that we're moving in the direction of something that might give value. And of course, if they tell us something, we have to be ready to pivot. We have to be ready to change tack and say we're wrong, you know. And that's why you minimize the amount of effort at each stage until you get that validation by talking to them, you know. So that's kind of, to us, it's a no-brainer. You have to do it, you know. Yeah.
And I think it's not only for the edtech startups, but entrepreneurs in general. They very often come up with an idea, and instead of running it through the potential clients and analyzing the market, analyzing the clients and their needs, they say, well, I've got this brilliant idea. I'm sure it will work. My friend Todd told me. So as I say, I mean, the moment when I think it's a very humble approach, right? Instead of focusing on myself and my business idea and how much I want it to happen, instead of doing that, I just go out of the building, ask questions, and maybe I'll come back to the building, say, okay, that was a very stupid idea. I have to start all over again.
Yep.
But it's much more effective and time efficient, isn't it?
It really is. And that's what I say. I mean, even that process I talked about on day one, you know, it might sound like a lot of work, but it's a hell of a lot less work than product development, you know. So, and it gives you, as I say, that insight to either pivot or to drop or to proceed, you know, and that's that confidence again. So, yeah. And I mean, on the other side, with those guys you're just talking about, Milena, they're afraid people are going to run away with their idea. People don't run away with ideas. Right? Google won't chase you till you're showing 1 billion turnover, you know. So that's another aspect, actually, I'll talk to a bit later. But I mean, you know, so I think that can be part of it, is this fear that it's going to be taken up and run with.
Yeah, but actually when you go out and ask questions, you don't go out to tell people about your product or your idea. You go out to find out what they think, right? So
Yeah,
it's nothing to do.
yeah, you ask them about their problem, not your solution. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Alison, Anissa, is there, in your research, do you use this kind of approach at any level or rather not?
So what's really interesting is, I mean, one of the principles behind Educate is this idea of user-centered participatory design, and that captures the sort of the culture that no one can do this on their own. You need to work, you need to collaborate with a whole host of different people to help you to really understand the context that you're designing for, who's involved in that context, who has a voice in that context. But it obviously, it's all in the context of startups with limited resources, often limited people and very limited time. So one of the challenges for us is to find, if you like, the right grain size to operate in, because, we can all have fantastic ambitions, but at the end of the day, you do have to do something. You have to act. And, we might criticize the way that research and academia works for being so slow, but that certainly wasn't the case in our context. We were able to find the right sort of researchers, and we'll say a little bit more about that later, but the right sort of researchers that you need around you as an EdTech startup to try to help you find the information you need in the right way. So, go out and conduct some user interviews. Well, what does that look like? Not everybody knows intuitively how to interview, or what you're interviewing about, or what data you need to catch from that. Is it, very thorough, or is it just a light touch sort of level? So the research methods that help you sort of uncover some of this evidence, in a very informal way in most cases, there's still methods there that help. So I think that capacity, the research capacity that you're trying to build, it's finding the right people to participate with you to help you move things forward, or move things in a direction that's going to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only going out of the building, but knowing why you are leaving that building and what you want to do.
And you'd be amazed how many people go get a focus group in the room, and then 5 minutes before the session go, what are we going to ask them, and how are we going to capture what they tell us? And it's like, it's the basics, it's the ABC of research methods. But if you've not done it before, how can you be expected to know what to do?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I have one more question to all of you, and I'm very curious. If suddenly you were given €1 million to support the EdTech ecosystem, what would you do with it and why? Anissa, would you like to start?
Can I have more if suddenly I had unlimited? So with €1 million, I think I would love to teach Educate's method to accelerators around the world, especially in developing contexts, to first of all teach the research training program in both streams, AI readiness as well. And then I would also love to teach my 6 superpowers of EdTech enterprises. And so to really empower different contexts. We're really lucky to have developed this in London. And I would love to see it in developing countries as well.
So investing in your product, right?
But if I had more money, then I would actually invest in the businesses as well and set up the accelerators around the world.
Sounds
but
great.
For $1 million, thank you.
For the start, Anissa. You have to start with something. Peter, how about you? What would you do?
I met a guy called Mike Ferrick a few years ago, and Mike Ferrick was working with, or used to work with, Chuck Feeney, who you might be familiar with. He's a philanthropist. He gave billions into education. Actually, he was very kind to Ireland in that respect. The Global Brain Health Institute is his last investment. But Mike Ferrick understood by doling out these billions that education is just something that it doesn't matter how much you pour into it, it's really hard to fix it. And I think based on that, I'd probably like, and I was thinking about it, I'd like to set up maybe like the EETN retreat in Alvor in Portugal, right? Nice, sunny place, a place where these people here, these fantastic people here, can gather and share ideas, because I don't think we can solve the problem, but what we could do with that money is, you know, basically work together. And I think that's a challenge we have an awful lot of the time, is we don't get enough time to talk together. I'm sure most of the people on this call have never heard of Learnovate. And I think that retreat could also be used, you know, again, we talked about getting out of the building, to get groups down, to get teaching groups down, to get learning and development groups down, and to basically give those people a headspace away from the normal day, and give us the EdTech research industry the ideas to go and solve for them. So I just think in that way, the million could be used to create something that goes on. That's probably what I would do with it. I'd also be caretaker and have to stay down there all the time, of course.
Love it. Alison, how about you?
Yes, so I mean, I'm a great believer. We actually invest in people. That you have to give money to people to enable them to develop in some way that is going to support the ecosystem. And I know from the challenges we had when we were trying to recruit researchers to work with us on Educate, that it's not a very easy persona to try to find, because on the whole, the missing link for many EdTech startups is access to educational researchers, the ones that understand learning. They can find the business mentors, they can go find the tech support, but the educational researchers is the really precious resource here. And there's two things going on there. One of them is in educational research generally, and in the university departments where the education departments are, they are not so used to working with industry. So they tend to be there because they really believe in the importance of education. They really want to research and understand things like how children learn to read, or what development in a particular language learning looks like. So they're real experts in their domain knowledge, but they certainly aren't expert at working with industry in the sort of participatory design ways we've talked about. So what I would do is I'd split the money in half. I'd use $500,000 to fund educational researchers around the world to collaborate with an EdTech near them, wherever they are, to just start baby steps on thinking about how their expertise can support that company. And then I'd take the other money and probably spend it on going to Peter's place with this group of people to share, come with their company participants, with the researchers, to share what they're doing. And that would be the opportunity where I would want to help teach some of the research methods, because we know that some of the research methodologies around the world, you know, some educational researchers are experts on certain types of research, but you actually need to have a really broad understanding of a range of research methods to be able to support EdTech companies in the right time, in the right place, and help them on that journey. So I see the big gap here as actually educational researcher capacity around the world. So that's where I put my my money.
And the other half to stay in Peter's place. And
well, then we kind of need to hang out there and have some boot camps. And you need, I mean, this is really key. You need time and headspace for this. Everybody does. Yeah. I mean, we're all so busy in our roles. We're all juggling multiple roles and multiple projects. So, you know, actually the value of just switching off things and going and immersing, I think, you know, it can't be underestimated. We all need it.
Yeah, I think as well, just as part of that is this concept of teaching to fish, you know. So I think that idea that if even as I say, those innovation methods along with the research methods, you know, to get people to be able to think in an innovation mindset, it's not difficult. You know, design thinking was given that name to allow non-designers think like a designer. So it's a structured way to approach that. So I think, again, if you get educators and people at the front line to think that way, the ideas start to come out too, you know. And not everyone needs to be an EdTech startup. It can be an in-class practice, you know. So I think that's another part of it too.
Absolutely. This can be just something that is being taught not only in the entrepreneurship program or in accelerator or during boot camps for people that are specifically interested in entrepreneurship or in educational technology, but it's one of these skills that nowadays we need for ourselves. As we said, we change our jobs, and probably every 5 years we have to reskill once again. So to know where to look for information, to know how to redesign our own way of participating in the job market is also very important.
Just a little point which kind of stretches across everything we've talked about as well, by the way, that get out of the building, we would consider 5 qualitative interviews. We call that validation, you know, so you're not looking to go out, just to give people on the call as well an idea of that size, and we call that validation. And if you talk to 5 people for 40 minutes, you actually start to see the mists starting to clear. And later, as we move on in that, you might look to verify. And look, we could argue about validate and verify, but just so as we know what we're talking about in the center, we use those 2 terms. So we validate with a small group and we verify as we go on with larger groups. And what we did at a qualitative level might turn into a quantitative surveys type research as you progress, you know, so you don't need to get 250 people interviewed to get moving, you know.
Definitely. And Anissa, what advice would you give to researchers, entrepreneurs, or students that are getting started in the EdTech sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think follow what you're interested in, read a lot. But I mean, when I first joined from the business world, I was really overwhelmed by all the literature. And Rose, one of my supervisors told me, Rose Luckin, she said, read whatever's most interesting to you. And then basically I got in, so you just, because it's really overwhelming, all the information that's out there, and also reach out to the researchers that, and you know, try to find mentors, and try to go to Peter's Island retreat and events like that to collaborate with people. But I think it's really important to follow your passion and what's most interesting. And I think that you always do well if you follow that, because there is really a lot out there.
And how about entrepreneurs? Is there any difference? Because when you are a student, when you are a researcher, you are doing one thing, but as an entrepreneur, is there any other advice that you would like to give?
Entrepreneurs to be open to because a lot of times entrepreneurs are really set on their ideas, and they have this amazing passion for solving the problem they set out to solve and are really confident, but to also be open and curious and open to the possibility of pivoting and learning from different places, from unexpected places, and just to constantly reflect and just try to develop a learning culture as much as possible.
Great. Alison, and what would you say to researchers or students in the field?
So what, starting out in EdTech, Milena, or? Yes?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, let's take researchers first. It's quite hard nowadays for researchers to not already have some interactions and connections with EdTech, because obviously we're all using learning tools and communication tools ourselves in our day-to-day work. So we've all got some experience or connections there. I think what's challenging for researchers is understanding how they can best translate some of their research findings to something that might be useful or accessible to EdTechs. And I mean, certainly I have a role of research engagement and impact lead within UCL IOE, and I spend most of my time with my colleagues who are researchers, you know, starting very often with that academic peer-reviewed paper, and you literally go through with a highlighter pen and you pull out, well, what are the key things in here that might be interesting to different audiences in our case. So if the audience is an EdTech, well, you know, we've got researchers who know amazing things about just how children pick up a second language. So second language acquisition, which of course is a massive area of interest for the EdTech sector. You know, they've really got a deep understanding of the way that understanding of languages develop, the sort of experiences that help that to happen, what that looks like for a 5-year-old, what it looks like for a 15-year-old, what it looks like for a 99-year-old. But, you know, all of these contexts are different. And it's the researchers who understand how their own research might apply in those different contexts, or would tell you when it doesn't apply. But often it's helping the researchers to see the value in what they do, because in academia, you know, we're sort of held to account by our papers and our presentations. We don't have to work with industry. It's desirable, highly desirable, but it isn't a requirement. So, you know, for academics, we need support ourselves to develop the ways that we can communicate our own findings to a range of audiences. So I think that's something you can start from day one. I mean, I would say Anissa is a fantastic example, where even at the point where she hasn't even defended her PhD yet, she's already thinking about translating what I know to be a highly theoretical thesis that very, very few people are going to read into something, as you'll see later this afternoon, that is almost speaking a different language. So that's a skill we can all benefit from in research, and we never stop learning how to do it. And also the media that we can use to communicate our research outcomes. So, you know, animations, cartoons, I mean, there's just so many communication forms that are more engaging for people who are outside of academia, that again, we have to learn and have support to be able to go in that direction.
How about students? Because we've heard a lot about researchers, but what about students?
Yeah, I mean, this is fantastic, because I had a call yesterday. I happen to be an external examiner for another Masters in Educational Technology program in the UK. And we just had the exam board last week, and I've been looking at student dissertations from their Masters program. And there were 3 dissertations in there that were conducted last summer in schools where teachers were having to respond to the context of COVID. And these are really, really important pieces of writing. Now, in the world of academia, sort of a master's dissertation is it's a master's dissertation. It's not quite a PhD. There's sort of a bit of a hierarchy on where you can publish, whether it's worth publishing. And my view is get a blog out that tells about, you know, how you overcame gathering the data in that context. Don't worry about peer-reviewed publications or who's going to say you can or you can't. One thing we can all do is tell our stories. I mean, we can all create the opportunities to tell about the work we're doing, the research we're doing. We have to be honest, we have to be humble, we have to not overclaim, we have to see it in its context, but it's really valuable knowledge. So I think with researchers, and I say this all the time to my students, I'm sorry to say it again, but be brave. Okay, there's something about being brave, being confident with what you know and what you're learning. And if you have the right voice, and interestingly, we haven't got Fran in the room now. I think she had to pop off somewhere else, but Fran's a very interesting lady who's becoming part of the EETN network, Fran Abrams. She runs an organization called the Education Media Centre in the UK. And this is an organization that really helps us to tell our stories. And I talk about storytelling because, you know, really that's all it is. A research report is a story. It's a certain type of story. It's not so engaging to an awful lot of people, but there's a narrative you can find within it that really helps to get your voice, find that voice, find your academic voice, be brave.
It's beautiful. I love it. We'll make t-shirts, EETN t-shirts, be brave. I love it. Peter, and if you could give an advice to maybe getting away a little bit from the research world itself, but focusing more on accelerators and incubators in the world of EdTech, what would you tell them?
I suppose just to add to Alison's story as well, I'm not sure. I'd be very interested to hear from the audience here as well. One of the things certainly in Ireland that would be an issue in the researcher angle, just to finish out on that, is tenure. There used to be a thing called tenure. It's now like a hen's tooth. So you get contracts. So when you're trying to, and back to Alison's point earlier about, you know, the struggle to attract quality researchers into this business. I think that's an issue. And as I said, I don't know how it pans out across the globe, but you can probably offer 3-year contracts with no promise of anything beyond. And yes, we know we work in a fluid market where people move around, but by the same token, it's hard to pull somebody out of a corporate or even directly out of university if basically you're offering them 3 years and then saying, all bets are off after that, but maybe it'll be okay. So that's just a point I thought I'd like to bring up at a very practical level. We are not an incubator or an accelerator, I think I should point out in that sense. So we are a research center. It could probably be a natural progression at some stage that we would look to incorporate that. And in fact, there are plans in Trinity at the moment that might well facilitate that. But at this moment in time, we're not. But however, our chairman, Johnny Parks, and I'd be surprised if there aren't at least a few people on here who know Johnny, because I always say if you pull up the EdTech string, the whole lot shuffles when you pick Johnny. But he did run an incubator out of Ireland, and we worked closely with them, and I did learn a lot about that, and we obviously would work with other incubators too. It's quite a sort of a thing again in Ireland, but I think it's around partnerships. I think an awful lot of the incubators and the accelerators need to have those partnerships. You're not going to create it in that little accelerator. They need to have those network tentacles going out. That can be to government. It certainly can be to academia, and obviously out to industry. And I think that's where their value will come, rather than just being landlords. I think it's that ability to sort of, and to know that industry. So when the guy comes in or the girl comes in with the super duper idea, you actually have enough savvy around that to sort of be able to advise knowledgeably on that. Matchmaking, I think, is another aspect that these guys really need to be able to do, is to sort of, do you know what, you're doing this, but actually that fits right in there, and then that becomes this, and the sum of the parts can be greater than the whole. And I think that idea too, knowing funding avenues, certainly again in our own local context, that would be huge, because there's a lot of supports out there, a European level, a global level, philanthropic, as we mentioned with Chuck Feeney earlier. So understanding those avenues, and again, I think a really important part about this is this: an awful lot of EdTech entrepreneurs may well be tech, so they've come up with some sort of tech, and they may not have a natural disposition. I saw it in the chat line there earlier about researchers understanding research and not necessarily business. And I think providing those sort of abilities for the people within an incubator and accelerator to even among themselves, to get out there and talk and present and learn how to kind of tackle that sort of aspect. And the other thing I think is to twin. So we would have twinned with 1776 over in Boston, and there you start to sort of see this idea that you're offering a win-win situation. So you're saying to any ed tech company over there in Boston, if you're looking to come to Ireland, you have a warm space, yeah, and then vice versa, sort of that idea. And obviously, again, there's knowledge share comes out of that. Most universities are going to have these, ours is called Trinity Research and Innovation. Get to know those departments within the universities in your area. They're going to be the guys with the finger on the pulse about what's coming out of any of the schools, and the sort of angles that can be taken out of that. And I mentioned this earlier, I think this idea of sharing, because again, people don't run away with ideas. We have this idea that once you're a sort of a two-man startup, everybody's going to want to run away with it. That's not really the case. You're much more likely to talk to somebody who can help you on the journey. So providing that ability to, get them pitching. And of course, my last one would be provide that innovation training, get those guys to understand how to approach these things from an innovative perspective. Everything we've talked about this morning, help them to understand how to progress down the story. I think they're great. As I say, we have Versari in Ireland, and we work with a few others, but yeah, I think they have to be an awful lot more than a landlord. That's probably what I'd say.
Great, I love that. And I'm looking right now in the chat that we have some questions from our participants. So question number 1: can we help EdTech to develop EV EdTech?
We help EdTechs to develop evidence-based. Yes, I think that's the research training programs essentially helping to develop the capacity in EdTechs to develop their own evidence-based EdTech and to develop that mindset. Because so one thing that the Educate program, when companies and came at first, they thought that we would do the research for them, but that's actually, the program was to develop the capacity in the companies to develop their own ed tech. So that's the difference with the Educate program. And so when they achieved the Edwards at the end, it means that they did their own research proposal. And if they achieved the Edward level 2, they actually did their own research. And so, and then the next stage of the Educate program, the AI readiness, is to systematize that data collection, to get ready to get your ducks in order, not to necessarily develop AI, but what data would you want to have all the time? What's important for you? What are the important data points for you to collect? And how would you get that? And so, yes, we have to, that was the goal of Educate, is to develop this research mindset in the enterprises and at that level.
I'm honestly very fascinated by the concept. I found it difficult. I mean, I can understand large enterprises. There is it's almost built into their way of making business, do research to develop a product that is evidence-based in a sense. But do you have even startups, or it's like you have a limit, like you have companies between 50 employees or 100 employees and up, but not below?
No, actually, it was just for startups. So
just for startups?
Yeah, the Educate is just for startups, and that's the whole thing. The reason that I was looking for a method was because I was an entrepreneur, and I thought, how do you develop this capacity if you don't have a budget for a research team, or you don't have this larger budget? So Educate is teaching, the research training program is teaching only if you have, so it's under a certain amount of turnover. Alison, do you remember how much it was?
So it's 3 million euros. So it's a classified EU SME. So under 3 million and under 250 employees. So you could be quite a big EdTech company and still fall into that category. But on the whole, I mean, interestingly, the paper that Anissa and I hope to get out in the new year gives you some of the data around the backgrounds of the startups, and they were on the whole much smaller. So I think we ended up with sort of around about 3 or 4 employees as being typical, but very early stage.
I don't know if I'm gonna be there in the afternoon, but please send all these references, because I'm really interested in reading this stuff. It's just,
and we can pick up a call afterwards, Italo. I mean, we're really keen to share what we did, our journey, how we went about it, because we do think this is something that can be replicated, undoubtedly.
Yes, and when this Corona thing is over, I really want to come to Educate in London and see what you've done.
Do.
Definitely.
You'd be welcome.
Answering that question, if I had a €1 million budget, would be is to train the trainers to then build capacity in EdTech startups, because you can't answer the question for startups in their own context. You always have to be empowering the startups to have this mindset. And then they can even choose if they want to. If they have a budget to choose researchers, great, but understand what the researchers are going to be doing, manage them, work together, and that way they can co-design. So it's starting to speak that research language within startups as well.
Yeah, and likewise, we would work with a lot of startups, so and we would work with an awful lot of what you would traditionally more call the startups, where maybe they're at 4 to 8 people at this stage, very early stage. But I mean, I suppose one of the things is, as a not-for-profit, we can lower that sort of financial bar for them. And likewise, we take them through that innovation process we talked about on day one, and again, part of the outcome from that is they do learn to fish themselves, and basically can take that aspect of it off. But it also then can help really identify where the research should be pointed at, where the that's the innovation research, we'll call it. That's the customer definition research. But then moving on into what is the problem, what angle of it might be tackled, you look on. And again, they would be able to avail of government supports to do that work, certainly in our region.
Is it possible to have a follow-up question?
Absolutely, go for it, Italo.
So the thing is, like, is it because the startups are more agile than the larger ones, so that you can actually work with them in a more agile way, so you can get all this, even the research into their practice. But also the other aspect is like, do they get like to certify somehow on their website, or when they sell a product, this is evidence-based product that we're selling to you?
Coming on that one, Anissa. So, I mean, there's two critical things which we realized very early on in the design of Educate. And one is that because, particularly in the startups, the products pivot so quickly, even the notion of a product that's been certified doesn't hang around for that long. And it was we weren't doing the research ourselves. So we weren't the researchers who could say, this is a robust bit of evidence and we are confident that this will work. We were supporting the enterprises to literally put their toe in the water to become educational researchers in that respect. And they wouldn't always apply the methods, you know, as we would, and the research wouldn't always be as conclusive. It was very much, you know, I would say master's level research, where you're giving people a safe space to try the methods. You want them to reach a robust study. They had a research mentor to partner and support them with that. But we were never going to be in a position where we would put UCL Institute of Education's mark on their product, because 6 months later, it's a different product. And this is a real issue for the industry in when you do validate products. And I really don't feel this is, I mean, I can understand the need for validation and you know, how validation helps in terms of making choices about edtechs from the consumer side. But from the research side, it's really problematic. So we were validating the companies as having a research mindset to give, if you like, buyers confidence that these were a trusted organization. And it's really interesting, sort of, you know, our early companies, we're now 2-3 years on now, and they value this mark. So this mark of evidence-based is something they see as being as important as our product works, because it kind of lets you know it's a continuing process. It's not something that was done once and then put on a shelf and never again. So we had this interesting sort of place to find, which was going to enable us to give them an incentive in a sort of badge. Anissa mentioned them, they're the Edwards. We were really pleased because we hadn't pushed them massively, but when we went to our BET exhibition in 2020, the Educational Technology exhibition in London, we saw this logo appearing on stands, and we hadn't in any way suggested that was something they might do. So that for us was a validation of this in the industry. And then of course people say, well, what's that, Mark? And you know, that very sort of by stealth method that says the industry is stepping up to want to produce evidence-based edtech as part of its social responsibility for working in education. And that's the line we've been taking. Rather than being the research police or the product police, let's just up the level of the conversation around evidence and hope that the industry picks up on it.
And there's an interesting comment from Johanna in the chat. I think the customers are being more critical when it comes to learning results. That's the reason why the companies need to do research. Absolutely. Well, first of all, Italo, thank you very much for joining and for your questions. And there's a question from Dina. Schools, institutions, teachers, practitioners fit in with this. How can the researchers and edtech developers expand this collaboration? For example, with the Educate Golden Triangle, how does it work in practice? Anissa, would you like to pick up?
So the Educate Golden Triangle, basically the Golden Triangle has the points, which are the three biggest stakeholders in edtech development. First, it's the edtech developers, the businesses themselves that are starting the product, that own the product. There's the research community that does research on the themes that the product and the education problems that the product's trying to solve and understand the research methods of how to know if the product is working. And then you have the users, which are the most important: students, teachers, learners, the facilitators, the buyers for those learners, that this is who it's for. It's all about the learner. And so, but there is a disconnect between these three, and oftentimes they operate in silos. And so the Educate program one of this golden triangle theory was that tried to bring these three together. And the approach that Educate took was to empower these research method training in the developers of the technology, because ultimately they're the ones that had the idea, that build the technology, and that then sell it to the learners, and to teach them the research methods and develop that research capacity, and also hopefully those relationships with the researchers, to then go to the learners and to do proper research to understand what is it that they actually want. And so this is the co-design that was happening, is basically building that capacity in EdTech enterprise to do that, because ultimately they own the products and they initiate it. And then Alison, if you want to talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, that's the golden triangle, and that was certainly the ambition, and it is the ambition. However, let me just pull something in here. When we originally conceived this project, we really thought we would have a teacher track. We would have this opportunity for teachers to come in to do this co-design with the researchers and the companies. We couldn't get a teacher out of school. Now, that's a very UK contextual thing. It's complicated to find time to work with teachers, and teachers could not work at the pace that the companies needed. So we had challenges in doing this in the formal program. So what we did was we focused on our work with the companies in helping them to learn and speak the language of their user base, doing many of the things Peter was suggesting. Talk to them, reach out to them, building into their research the ways that they could and would connect with them. But we didn't sort of formally manage that inside the program. But what we did do, and again, there's quite a number of papers coming out in 2020 on the outcomes of Educate, which sort of only finished a year ago. One of them is the whole EdTech taxonomy or ontology, the language of the sector. And we've done some phenomenal work building out this taxonomy. And, some of it's really basic and obvious. Let me give you a really tangible example. In the tech industry, when you introduce somebody to your platform or your tech product, we call it onboarding. Okay, and onboarding comes out of most SME, EdTech SMEs' lips, somewhere in there, we're going to be onboarding. Now, you go into a school and say to the head teacher, when can I come and onboard your teachers to my product? And they'll just look at you blankly, because it's not a word in that culture. If you say, can we organize some professional development and training for the teachers in your schools on how to make this product work in your classrooms, you have a completely different conversation. So that's a very simple, easy example, but we were littered with, phraseology that sits in the education sector that has got no meaning in the tech sector, and vice versa. And equally, I would say in the research domains, translating and understanding the words of research both applies to the users as well as the companies themselves. So we did a lot of translation and a lot of support for understanding just the words we were using, to be honest. So yes, it's part of the challenges.
Yeah, I think I see Andreas is asking in the chat there about the corporate learning side, and ironically, we have what we call a purple triangle. You would have seen it again in the first presentation, where we talk about Learnovate as researchers, we talk about that EdTech company, and we talk about the organization with the problem, and it's the same players, But we say that what you've got here is EdTech and that company work well together. They don't need us, yeah. But what happens, and we validated this by getting out of the building, is when the user company comes up with an issue or a problem, they don't really understand the true level of that problem. So they turn to this EdTech supplier and say, can you help me with this mushy problem? They turn around, because they don't have the capacity to do research, and they turn around to the shelf and go, whoa, I have this that might kind of fit. And then this kind of relationship happens where, there's sort of, and nobody's prepared to say it wasn't brilliant. So they all sort of just agree it was okay. And that's where we see we can come in to crack the hard nut, as we call it, So it's where there's an issue. And if we can help that triangle, basically listening to both sides and working with both sides to solve that problem, and then we get out of there again, because that's us. That's us basically solving that hard nut. But what we realized in the early stages of Learnovate was we listened way too much to the EdTech companies and not nearly enough to the organizations. And we made a conscious change about 3 years ago, and we engaged with that organizational side of it. And we actually have formed a thought leader circle, which gets thought leaders from that side of the table together to understand the problems. And part of the work we do as our core research is we say we kick the can down the road. We see actually, because nobody has the capacity to take on that problem using our own government funding, we'll kick that down the road a bit and then say, hey guys, is this getting to a point where it's interesting for you now to take on, you know? So that's how we would use it in the corporate side. And excuse the direction of the sun is now making me look like I'm basking in heavenly rays.
It can be a sign, Peter, we don't know. One more question before we'll move to Peter's presentation, because after this panel, we'll give the stage to Peter, who will talk more about well, his research results, actually. So that will be interesting because we haven't mentioned it until now. So hold on to and wait for that. The last question, what's the common pitfall that EdTech startups tend to make during trainings when they try to frame their research question or proposal? Could you please give us one example of the pitfalls and how you bring them to the right track?
I'm certainly happy. Oh my goodness, having mentored, I think probably I mentored about 100 or so of the companies. So I've been down this journey. It's exactly, I mean, for those of you doing master's degrees, trying to come up with research questions right now, it's exactly the same challenges that we all face when we try and come up with research questions. And that is both really thinking carefully about what sort of research might be needed to match that question. So if you ask with a question, start with a question that starts with how, it's a very different research approach to if you start with a question that says does. Yeah, so the type of research is very much indicated by the question. Coming up with research questions that were doable, and when I say doable, most of the companies to begin with wanted to ask a research question that related to when they built their product out, which might be 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years time. Okay, because most of them were seed or Series A, they were early stage, they didn't have a robust product yet. So they nearly always started with a question that was completely overambitious, like, does my product work, with, you know, insert name of product there, when they didn't even have a product yet. So real basics, over ambition, and you know, that was why they needed the mentoring, because the mentoring allowed them to just say, right, so if you were going to do that, what data would you need? What data have you got? Okay, so let's rethink that. So mentoring was very much about having the conversation around defining the terms in the question, thinking about what data might be needed, and then if you have both of those accessible, what sort of methods might be appropriate. And how long was it going to take? You know, no point coming up with a question that was going to take 3 years to answer. So we were trying to be agile in the research approach, to do something tangible, next 6 months, for which you've got existing data, or it would be possible for you to get data.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alison. And I see more questions in the chat, and I'm sorry, but we are not able to ask them right now publicly. But Alison, Anissa, would you mind following up on
We're very happy to do a sort of FAQs or something out of this talk and collate what's there. If you send us the extract of the text conversations down the messages, that'd be great, Milena. We'll work on that. We'd have fun doing that.
Fantastic.
Also in the afternoon, we can answer questions.
And we might be able to address some this afternoon as well. Yeah.